All right, welcome back to the channel. Today, going over a book that's back on the topic of psychoanalysis, psychodynamic therapy, that sort of genre. This is a book that I've had on my shelf for a while now, and it's just kind of been getting backlogged for me. And despite that, I think I still read it at the right time. I kind of appreciate that I read a couple books before this one, or rather that has helped me to appreciate the content of this book even more. And this is Freud and Beyond. It's by Stephen A. Mitchell and Margaret J. Black. It is essentially, and this is even the subtitle, a history of modern psychoanalytic thought. So it takes you from Freud and literally goes beyond Freud, talking about all those who came after him and tried to adapt his ideas and theories, or even to rework them in different ways. So it gives you an idea of how all the things you're learning now about psychoanalysis or psychodynamic therapy, where these ideas originated from, like who were the forefathers of these ideas. Now, initially, I had a bit of some frustration with the book. I found that the writing style was a bit frustrating. Lots of sentences that just bordered on run-on sentences with a lack of appropriate commas and things. And so it was just jumbled around, and I found myself rereading sentences to, oh, this is what they're trying to say, this is what they're talking about. It was frustrating. I just feel like this book could really benefit from a new edition where you have a good editor go through and clean up a lot of the writing style. But as I progressed through the book, I noticed a couple things in regards to that, just to get this out of the way. That some chapters were written more clearly than others. And considering that there are two authors, it may be that one author was contributing to this problem more than the other. And besides that, as I went forward through the book and as I got to the end of the book, I noticed that it was just less of an issue, I think, because I just got used to their writing style. I got used to the way that they were saying things and used to their long sentences. So I wouldn't let that deter you from the book, but if you notice, if you get into the book and you're frustrated by that, just kind of push through it, I would say. Now, starting with Freud, you get his foundational ideas. The idea with Freud, a lot of people like to criticize him, especially lay people, because of his crazier ideas. And I actually empathize with that to a degree. But a lot of his genius is so foundational to the way that even everyday people conceptualize the mind now, with the idea of the conscious and the subconscious that influences the conscious and other aspects of psychological thought. His ideas were so foundational that we now take them for granted as just fact, as just a general way of thinking about and conceptualizing the mind, when in fact a lot of this came from him. And he went out on a limb during his time to put forth these ideas. Now, on the topic of Freud, beyond those more foundational ideas, as he gets more and more into specifics, we'll touch on that later, because that's where I take more issue with his ideas and empathize more with people who criticize him. It takes you from there, and then we get into his daughter, Anna Freud, her work on describing and organizing the different defense mechanisms, which we learn today in school and we see playing out in ourselves as well as others. Really foundational framework for defense mechanisms put forth by her. Talk about Harry Sullivan, his emphasis on the importance of interpersonal psychoanalysis and conceptualizing the patient's mode of being and feeling as a product of their environment, particularly their social environment, which I found to be really useful. And as I was reading the section on Harry Sullivan, I was thinking, this really aligns with the way that I tend to conceptualize patients' problems. And I think that it is so valuable to think about how their issues likely stem from adaptations. But in a hospital setting or even a clinic setting, it may not make sense why they would be behaving in particular ways, why certain patterns may be playing out. But this Harry Sullivan, implores us to remember to think about what they're doing and saying, how they're acting in the context of their social environment. We're such social creatures, so thinking about our environment, think about it in a social context, and maybe some of those patterns make more sense given that context. So I just found that really useful, and I like that. I want to learn more about Harry Sullivan's thought as I move forward. Get into Melanie Klein and Wilfred Bion, and how they contributed profoundly to the understanding of the relationship between the analyst and the patient, emphasizing the mutual dynamics of the transference and the countertransference, and how this interplay is a rich source of meaning to be explored during analysis. And Freud's original idea of the psychoanalytic process the analyst was to be very cold and removed from the situation. But as we move forward, we see that one, an analyst is not really ever going to be able to fully achieve that, and to see that the transference as well as the countertransference it's all meaning within the context of the therapy to be explored and to derive value from. And Melanie Klein and Wilfred Bion, they really emphasize that. We get into Betty Joseph, her emphasis on crafting interpretations in a language that aligns with the patient's experience, and that she warns against interpretations that rely too heavily on this abstract symbology, and advocating for clarity and relatability in communication, which I think is really valuable, because a lot of the earlier emphasis was on making the language surrounding this whole process to be really esoteric, really outside the realm of what the patient could oftentimes understand or make use of, which I think is an even more important way of putting the point. And so Joseph emphasizing to take a step back and put things into a context for each individual patient that makes sense for them and that is most useful for them. That's the whole point of the therapy, is for the patient to derive use from it. We get into Winnicott and the concept of the analyst creating a holding environment for the patient to safely explore their true self and inner world in a compassionate and practical environment within the therapeutic context. And I've been working on finding, opportunities to see this play out in a clinical setting where the psychiatrist or the therapist is creating a holding environment for the patient. And I think it's really critical that the practitioner build up their strength of ego so that they can maintain that holding environment for the patient, rather than the patient, in an opposite way. We certainly don't want the clinician trying to have the patient hold their emotions for them. So Winnicott's emphasis on this holding environment, I really like that, and I've been working on seeing that play out in more contexts, trying to keep it in my mind and be aware of it. We get to Kohut and advocacy for empathetic immersion, how it's critical. It's a reminder not to impose preconceived notions onto the psychoanalytic process by resisting the urge to fit patients into predefined categories. Analysts can approach each case with a greater openness and authenticity. We've talked about this a little bit already, but this idea of tailoring each therapeutic process to the particular patient, not trying to fit the patient into predefined notions of what should be happening or of what is going to take place in the therapy. Ray Schaefer focused on returning agency to the patient, and how one of the most empowering aspects of psychoanalysis is this. He asserts that the core transformation and analysis lies in the patient's gradual assumption of agency over previously disclaimed actions. So, moving forward there, initially patients perceive their beliefs about themselves and the world as objective truths. You see this all the time with patients, particularly patients that are depressed, and over time they've thought about everything more and more in a negative context that is both permanent in state and time. And so they begin to take on these negative fantasies as objective truth. They see themselves as victims of external forces a lot of the times, and through analysis they can come to understand that they may derive an unconscious pleasure and a sense of control from these beliefs. This is pretty deep as a concept, but I think it's very powerful. And they even suffer because of these things, even if they're deriving some sort of adaptive pleasure from them. Or comfort maybe is a better word that makes a little bit more sense in this context, that it's still hurting them in the end. And as patients acknowledge their own role within this, as the architects of these mental frameworks, I love this, they begin to imagine alternative choices and organize their experiences in a more open and constructive way. Super powerful stuff there. Now, there was some interesting ideas, to put it lightly, on perspectives of trauma and abuse. Shingold posits that psychological freedom lies in acknowledging one's unconscious wishes, such as saying that a victim of abuse in some way wanted the abuse to happen. I think this is a really dangerous line to walk, because I think this is true less often than it would be true, and I would not recommend approaching a traumatized patient in this way and assuming that they in some way wanted the trauma to take place, I don't think that that would be a very useful way to approach a patient, and I think it could even be harmful. So I would use this perspective with caution. In contrast, Davids and Frawley focus on the destruction of reality testing in abused children, for example, and they argue that the analyst's starting point should be on the readiness to believe the patient's perspective, with the burden of proof lying in the evidence to the contrary. For them, the greatest danger is invalidating a patient's experience and colluding in their denial. So. Finally, to speak more on Freud, we see that as you go through the book and as you go through all these different characters that came along, many of them had this great reverence for Freud. We can understand that. We can understand that at the time there were less avenues than we have available to us today to explore their own points and to put their own points out there. It was sort of an in-group and out-group sort of thing. You wanted to maintain your alliance with these psychoanalytic groups and not be exiled so that you could continue to make a name for yourself. So we can see how they would have this reverence for Freud, but so much time seems to be spent on trying to maintain and make sense of this phallocentrism and this idea that everything is stemming from sexual desires and desires of aggression. And it seems like so many great minds put so much effort into trying to maintain these ideas and rework them subtly without stepping on Freud's toes, that I fear how much perhaps was lost during that time. How much more progress could have been made if people were more readily able to say, okay, I like these ideas of Freud's, but the rest of this, as he gets more and more granular in his details of his theories, it seems to make less and less sense. And I really respect those who had the courage, let's say, to dispense with it entirely and say, no, I'm not working with that. I'm bringing about a new framework to make sense of these things that go on within humans, because I think it's a really shallow conceptualization of the human spirit and human nature to say that everything's deriving from a sexual impulse or an aggressive impulse. There's so much more to people than that. And so I think that it really takes a courageous actor to stand for what they believe in and to put forth their own ideas, rather than feeling like they have to maintain everything that Freud has said and just rework it subtly and trying not to offend him. And as I read more about Freud, he seems like he was often easily offended. I think that his ideas make a lot of sense, the more granular ideas within the sense that he was great at marketing his theories in the context of this more sexually repressed Victorian culture of his time. But that's not the most useful, those ideas aren't the most useful to carry forward and to take as objective fact when it comes to exploring the human mind and finding ways to help people. So that is Freud and Beyond. And clearly I learned a lot from this book. It gives you a great overview of the history of psychoanalytic thought, which is the defined purpose of the book. And from there, it gives you all the avenues you can take to explore individual modes of thought more in depth. If you're curious, I read this book following on the heels of, let me grab these books, Psychodynamic Psychotherapy and Long-Term Psychodynamic Psychotherapy. So I believe I've already made videos on both of these books. You can check those out if you want. I think reading these three together is a great opportunity to really expand your knowledge of psychoanalysis or psychodynamic therapy in general. So I would recommend all three of those. And that is Freud and Beyond. I appreciate you checking out this video. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Like this video if you enjoy these topics. And as always, I appreciate you taking the time to watch. I'll see you in the next one. See ya.